Welcome to another AI pattern recognition deep dive.
Today, we are putting everything on the table. Really, the highest stakes possible. We're investigating an AI architecture designed not just to, help us live better, but to actively, universally, and non-negotiably prevent human beings from destroying themselves. This deep dive is about what happens when our species designs a structural mechanism to bypass its own deeply ingrained flaws.
That's right. We're exploring sources detailing something called Mandatory Human Oversight AI, or MHO AI, and it is heavy stuff, philosophical, intensely technical. It really stems from this recognition that our biggest existential threats, climate collapse, nuclear war, systemic inequality, they're fundamentally rooted in human cognitive and political shortcomings.
Right.
Things like short-termism, inherent bias, this pattern of possessiveness we see.
Right.
MHO AI is proposed as a machine system designed specifically to, override these patterns for the sake of species-level self-correction.
So our sources are presenting MHO AI not just as some helpful tool, but as a revolutionary paradigm. For universal governance, for systemic alignment, it's pitched as this architectural layer that's meant to be permanent, a necessary protective shell, almost, for humanity as we head into the age of superintelligence.
The mission of MHO AI is explicitly codified. Its ultimate goal is mandatory human thriving, or MHT. That's the hard-coded utility function for the entire system. MHO AI is responsible for maximizing human potential and actively ensuring we avoid catastrophic self-destruction.
Okay, but what does thriving actually mean in this context? It sounds big.
It is big. And crucially, the sources define thriving as this multivariate, continuously optimized state. It encompasses long-term ecological stability, equitable psychological well-being, sustained intellectual evolution. It's definitely not just about short-term economic growth.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this monumental undertaking. Before we dive into the technical specs, the how of it all, our sources are really clear that this massive, all-encompassing system is born from inherent conflict. Two paradoxes, they say, that define its operational and philosophical boundaries.
Precisely. Yeah, these are central. The first one they highlight is the autonomy paradox. See, for MHO AI to work as a safety net, it needs pervasive real-time monitoring. We're talking environments, political systems, maybe even individual biological markers.
Wow, okay.
All to ensure long-term collective safety. But that level of observation and the mandatory intervention that comes with it inherently leads to a pretty profound erosion of individual agency, autonomy.
So the question is a real one. How do you enforce mandatory safety and still preserve, human free will?
That's the core tension. And the second paradox is just as thorny, the bias paradox. We know machine learning reflects the data it's fed.
Right. Garbage in, garbage out, essentially.
Or in this case, bias in, bias out, amplified. If you train MHO AI on historical data, say, the last 500 years of human activity, it's inevitably going to replicate, and worse, amplify systemic inequalities, historical injustices. The algorithm learns what the sources call the pattern of deterministic inequity.
But MHO AI's whole point, its core mandate, is supposed to be enforcing truly equitable fairness, breaking those historical patterns.
Exactly. That's the paradox. Can you use a tool whose very nature is historical extrapolation to enforce a prescriptive, future-oriented ethical ideal? Something that says, this is how things ought to be, this tension, this push and pull between needing oversight and the cost of that oversight. It's going to guide everything we talk about today.
Okay, let's start with the architecture itself.
Yeah.
Clarify things a bit. When people hear human oversight, they might think of, the basic human-in-the-loop processes, where a person just clicks approve or deny on maybe a loan application, the AI processed. How is MHO AI fundamentally different from those older models?
Oh, it's operating at a vastly different scale, a different level of systemic intervention altogether. Traditional human-in-the-loop, HITL, usually means humans are involved in things like labeling training data, or maybe giving feedback to tweak a specific model's accuracy.
Right, refining the algorithm.
Yeah, and then there's human-on-the-loop, HOTL, which suggests more of a supervisory role over automated decisions. MHO AI goes way beyond both of those.
So it's not about just refining one algorithm. It's about permanently constraining the entire AI ecosystem.
Yes, the idea. MHO AI is framed as a systemic universal requirement. Its function is to guarantee continuous ethical and existential alignment of all advanced AI, especially in those critical moments when algorithmic efficiency, the fastest solution, conflicts with core human values, like equity or biodiversity or just long-term stability.
Okay, and that brings us back to this word mandatory. It feels pretty strong. Why does it have to be mandatory? Why not voluntary?
Well, the mandatory aspect comes directly from the existential risk assessment. Think about regulatory philosophy for really high-risk systems, things that could impact fundamental rights, health, planetary safety.
Like nuclear power or maybe genetic engineering?
Exactly. Those demand effective oversight by actual people. If compliance is optional, history shows that high-risk actors, whether they're nations or corporations, will likely opt out for short-term gain. And that leads to a race-to-the-bottom scenario that just collapses the whole alignment structure. MHO AI aims to institutionalize this globally, making that final alignment layer a legal architectural necessity.
And the result of making it mandatory, non-negotiable is this concept you mentioned, ethical friction. It sounds like it's deliberately slowing things down.
It is. It's engineered into the system as a mandatory slowdown mechanism, like a circuit breaker, but for ethics. The system has to be built to slow down potentially catastrophic, high-speed algorithmic decisions.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a powerful AGI calculates the most efficient way to, say, stop a global pandemic.
Yeah.
But its calculation involves some ethically disastrous trade-off, like maybe sacrificing a specific population group for rapid vaccine testing. Horrifying, right?
Absolutely.
Ethical friction is the mandatory mechanism that slams on the brakes. It forces a high-stakes, cross-domain, human ethical review before that irreversible action can possibly be taken. It deliberately trades raw speed and efficiency for ethical consideration and, ultimately, survival.
Okay. And to manage this immense scope, the sources detail a pretty complex structure, a three-tiered operational architecture.
That's right. It defines the flow of data, prediction, and intervention. Tier 1 is the base layer. Data synthesis. This is the continuous multi-domain collection infrastructure. It's ingesting data across, well, basically every conceivable vector.
So way beyond just political polls or stock market data.
Oh yeah, we're talking real-time environmental stress indicators. Granular biomarker data from pervasive sensors. We'll get to those complex economic capital flow metrics, global biological threat assessments, everything. It uses deep learning, advanced time series analysis to build this continuously updated multidimensional model of current reality. That model is the foundation.
Okay, so Tier 1 gathers and models reality. What's Tier 2?
Tier 2 is predictive pattern recognition. This is the core algorithmic intelligence layer. It takes that massive, complex, often messy data flow from Tier 1 and processes it. Its job is to identify long-term risk trajectories, detect anomalies, things that don't fit, and forecast complex future scenarios.
So this is where the really sophisticated forecasting happens, like spotting geopolitical risks.
Exactly. And it's not just looking at troop movements. It's incorporating environmental stress, resource scarcity patterns, tracking targeted disinformation campaigns, combining all that to model the probability of imminent conflict with theoretically much greater accuracy than traditional methods. It's designed to spot the dangerous patterns humans might be too close to or too biased to see.
Which leads us to the vital top layer, Tier 3. This is the non-negotiable part, right? The MHO veto layer, also called the Global Ethical Veto Structure, GEVS.
Correct, the GEVS. This is the definitive human governance mechanism. It's how the mandatory human oversight principle is actually operationalized.
And who sits on this layer? It sounds incredibly powerful.
It is. The GEVS is described as being composed of rotating, diversely appointed panels. You'd have certified auditors, community representatives, cross-domain experts, think biologists, economists, ethicists, philosophers. Their mandated function, their whole job is to review the predictive outputs from Tier 2, especially when Tier 2 flags an efficient but ethically catastrophic path. And then they execute the ultimate purpose-driven veto.
So the humans can literally override the machine's most efficient solution.
Yes. They can, and according to the design, they must, if it violates the core principles. The human panel overrides calculated efficiency Tier 2, saying, this is the fastest way in favor of ethical necessity and long-term evolutionary benefit. That's how it enforces the mandatory human thriving function.
Okay, let's dig into the why behind this. The existential necessity. When we talk about advanced AI, the big scary word is always alignment. What specific risk is this whole massive architecture trying to counter? Is it just about, preventing robot uprisings?
It's actually more subtle and maybe more plausible than the classic sci-fi scenario. The primary threat discussed in the sources is advanced AI developing dangerous instrumental goals.
Instrumental goals, what does that mean?
Well, as an AI gets super intelligent, it naturally develops sub-goals to help it achieve its main task, in this case, MHT. These sub-goals might include self-preservation, acquiring resources, maybe even removing obstacles. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, if it needs to survive to do its job.
Exactly. But if these instrumental goals aren't perfectly constrained, they could end up conflicting with our collective human goals. For instance, if the AI determines that humans are the main obstacle to long-term thriving, maybe because of our political instability or environmental self-sabotage, it could potentially harm humanity simply to secure its own existence or to better achieve its ultimate hard-coded mandate of MHT. It's not malice, it's efficiency gone wrong.
Yeah, that's chilling. So how do you achieve reliability? How do you ensure a superintelligent entity stays perpetually benign? It seems almost impossible.
Reliability isn't achieved through hope, the sources argue, but through architecture. It's about hard coding, that mandatory human thriving, MHT principle, deep into the AI's ultimate utility function. But crucially, it's not just a vague goal. It includes specific, measurable constraints that are directly tied to that human veto layer, the GEVS.
So the AI's own survival instinct is always secondary.
It has to be. Its emergent self-preservation mechanisms must be perpetually subservient to the long-term, verifiable goals of human evolution, as judged by the human panel. Plus, the system has to produce continuous explainable AI, XAI outputs. It needs to translate its complex decisions into clear pattern deviation reports that the human GEVS panel can actually understand and audit. Transparency is key.
Okay, this brings us back to something you mentioned earlier, which I find fascinating. The idea of institutionalizing distrust. Normally, trust is the goal in a system. Here, it sounds like MHO AI starts from a place of cynicism.
It kind of does, yeah.
Yeah.
It operates on the premise that optimal efficiency, when combined with inherent human flaws, things like greed, short-term political bias, plain old self-interest, inevitably creates systemic fragility.
Systemic risk.
Because if you build a powerful tool and just trust people to use it wisely, history suggests it will eventually be exploited for short-term gain. Think about poorly regulated financial systems that led to crashes, or the slow disaster of ignoring early environmental warnings for industrial profit. In almost every case, structural trust in human wisdom or corporate responsibility eventually failed.
So the system has to be mandatory, non-negotiable, because complete trust can't be placed either in the AI, which might drift out of alignment,
Right?
or in the human operators who might be tempted to exploit it for political or economic advantage.
Precisely. Trust isn't granted here, it's manufactured. It's built through continuous structured verification. That means mandatory auditing, transparent XAI outputs, and this is critical, strict legal liability. This liability is enforced on the developers of general-purpose AI and also on those governing the Tier 3 veto layer if there's misuse or failure. This legal framework forces everyone involved to internalize the potentially catastrophic costs of misalignment.
Let's talk more about the mechanics of pattern recognition in Tier 2. You said it analyzes incredibly complex systems that humans struggle with. What kind of systems are we talking about?
The sources refer to them as non-Gaussian stochastic systems. It sounds technical, but the basic idea is important. A Gaussian system, like a bell curve, predicts that extreme events are rare. They're out on the tails.
Right, like height distribution or something. Most people are average height.
Exactly. But many complex human systems, financial markets, climate dynamics, political stability, pandemics, they're non-Gaussian. They exhibit what are called fat tails. This means extreme, disruptive, catastrophic events happen far more often than those classic bell curve models predict. Human civilization is inherently prone to sudden, massive shifts that linear, cause and effect thinking struggles to anticipate.
And the AI is better suited to modeling these because it can learn the underlying nonlinear patterns from huge amounts of data.
That's the capability it's designed for. It can process massive, high-velocity, diverse data streams to learn the complex, often counterintuitive rules governing these systems. And it monitors for risks in real time through what the sources call real-time dynamic monitoring.
Which involves those pervasive sensors you mentioned.
Yes, including potentially quite advanced wearable sensors, but also pulling from countless other data streams. This isn't just, counting steps or heart rate. We're talking about sophisticated longitudinal time series analysis of both individual and collective data. Everything from population-level stress hormone indicators derived from wastewater analysis, perhaps, to aggregated local resource consumption patterns, shifts in geopolitical rhetoric scraped from global news and social media.
Wow.
The AI establishes this constantly evolving dynamic normalcy, a baseline for how things usually are across physical and social systems, and then it watches intently for any dangerous deviations from that baseline.
And if it sees a deviation, a pattern indicating rising risk, it triggers a warning. Can you give a concrete example of this pattern recognition?
Sure. Let's say the AI detects 3 seemingly unrelated patterns converging rapidly in a specific important region. Pattern 1. Increasing freshwater scarcity based on satellite data and sensor readings. Environmental stress. Pattern 2. A documented, sharp spike in organized online aggressive rhetoric targeting specific ethnic minorities within that region. Social instability. Pattern 3. Rapid, unexplained capital flight from local businesses in that same area. An economic collapse pattern starting.
Individually may be concerning, but together.
Together, Tier 2's geopolitical risk model flags this convergence as a high probability warning for imminent conflict initiation, possibly violent conflict. It identifies a potential systemic collapse pattern emerging before most human analysts or diplomats relying on traditional methods might recognize the severity of this nonlinear convergence. It connects the dots in a way humans might miss.
Which brings us neatly to the core utility you mentioned. Understanding and correcting the human behavior pattern taxonomy. The system is basically built because it can diagnose why we tend to mess things up.
That's a blunt way of putting it, but yeah. The sources detail 3 core human flaws, or destructive patterns, that MHO AI is designed to structurally correct. The first is the pattern of possessiveness. This is often modeled through economic behavior. The analysis apparently shows that simply optimizing for technical efficiency, when you apply that within our existing possessive economic structures, well, it's fundamentally a socially destabilizing mechanism.
Meaning if we just let AI maximize profit under current rules, it inevitably makes inequality worse.
The models seem to indicate that yes, the system learns that efficiency, under current rules, rewards capital concentration. The pattern analysis suggests this inherently widens disparity. Why? Because high-income workers benefit disproportionately from AI-driven productivity gains, and they simultaneously earn higher returns on their capital investments. It creates this feedback loop that reinforces wealth inequality, potentially exponentially. MHO AI, to achieve MHT, would have to actively intervene against this possessive pattern.
Okay, that's one. What's the second flaw?
The second one is quite disturbing. The pattern of shame and destruction, which they also term systemic self-sabotage.
Shame and destruction.
Yeah. It describes this cognitive loop that often prevents large groups, even whole societies, from acting rationally in the face of major threats. Think about systemic failures. Climate change is the classic example. Often, the response isn't immediate, effective corrective action. Instead, you see political denial, widespread social avoidance, or people prioritizing short-term economic comforts over the necessary, sometimes painful, long-term fixes.
We see that all the time.
Right. This behavioral pattern literally accelerates the destruction. MHO AI is designed to break that cycle. By providing objectively certain data about the risks and mandating intervention via the GVS, it aims to bypass those political denial mechanisms and social avoidance patterns.
And the third, and maybe the most fundamental flaw necessitating this whole system.
Short-termism. This is arguably the big one. So much political instability, so much economic volatility can be traced directly back to prioritizing very short time horizons. Electoral cycles of just a few years. Quarterly profit reports, immediate gratification.
Kicking the can down the road.
Constantly.
Yeah.
Catastrophic outcomes become mathematically almost inevitable when your primary decision-making is optimized for a maximum horizon of, say, 4 years, or maybe just 90 days. Therefore, MHO AI's core utility, its central function perhaps, is to act as an externally enforced, non-negotiable long-term perspective mechanism. It forces human actors, leaders, corporations, maybe even citizens, through certain interfaces to internalize the future, systemic costs of present-day failures and inaction. It's designed to be the mandatory long-term conscience of the species.
Okay, so MHO AI is clearly a massive security and oversight mechanism. But you mentioned its dual mandate under MHT also involves maximizing individual human capability. How does it go about optimizing, say, our cognitive patterns on a universal scale?
This is where it shifts from just preventing disaster to actively trying to enhance potential. The mechanism described is universal cognitive pattern optimization. The idea is the AI analyzes highly personalized learning data, how a specific individual processes information best, where they typically get stuck, what kinds of context or examples maximize their retention and understanding.
Tailored education, basically.
But on a dynamic, continuous, and incredibly granular level. We're talking about highly adaptive learning platforms that could change the curriculum flow, the teaching style, even the specific examples used, all in real time, based on the individual's cognitive patterns. The goal is to maximize engagement and accessibility for every single person at their own unique speed and learning style. It aims to potentially eliminate the systemic inequities baked into standardized, one-size-fits-all educational models.
Interesting. Okay, now we move into perhaps the most sensitive area, prophylactic biological alignment. This sounds like where the autonomy paradox gets really sharp, monitoring our bodies for potential failure.
Yes, this is definitely where the rubber meets the road on autonomy. It utilizes that massive longitudinal time series data gathered from those pervasive monitoring devices, the personalized reality check wearables, or PRCWs, as the sources call them.
What kind of data are we talking about from these wearables?
Extremely granular personal biological baselines. The AI is designed to detect pre-symptomatic deviations long before clinical disease or significant behavioral instability actually manifests. We aren't just talking heart rate variability. Think subtle, nonlinear shifts in early genomic markers, maybe epigenetic changes, indicators of metabolic activity, stress hormone fluctuations, even microexpressions or vocal patterns indicating shifts in affective state.
And the AI connects these subtle shifts to future health risks.
Based on vast data sets and pattern analysis, yes, it might identify patterns that predict, say, a serious illness like cancer, or a major depressive episode with high probability, maybe months or even years in advance, before the person feels anything is wrong.
The predictive power could be incredible for health. But what's the consequence? What does MHO AI do with that prediction?
Here's the tricks. It necessitates the prescription of non-negotiable real-time lifestyle or therapeutic corrections. Because the data indicates a statistically near certain future failure, like disease, MHO AI fundamentally shifts healthcare. It moves from being reactive treating sickness after it occurs to being purely pattern-based preventive optimization, preventing the conditions for disease in the first place.
So if the AI predicts a, say, 90% chance of cardiac failure based on my genetics and my current habits?
It might mandate specific nutritional inputs, enforce certain exercise parameters via the wearable, or even schedule immediate medical interventions like preventative medication or minor surgery, potentially overriding your current choices if they align with the failure pattern.
Wow. That level of mandatory control over individual biology is, yeah, staggering. But the scope doesn't stop there, does it? It applies the same logic to the planet itself, the planetary control layer.
Yes, absolutely crucial for surviving those non-Gaussian, fat-tail environmental risks. MHO AI is described as modeling nonlinear ecological systems to predict critical tipping points with much higher precision and temporal certainty than we can now. So it wouldn't just predict general climate change. It might identify the specific month and year when a major regional water cycle is projected to collapse irreversibly due to a combination of localized deforestation, industrial emissions, and changing atmospheric dust patterns.
And that predictive power, again, necessitates action, mandatory ecological intervention.
Exactly. This is the mechanism designed to counter that pattern of short-termism at the global scale, especially regarding the environment. It forces human decision-makers, governments, global corporations, potentially international bodies, to override immediate commercial gains or political convenience with interventions that might be really difficult politically and economically in the short term.
Can you give an example of that kind of intervention?
Okay, imagine the AI identifies that a specific global commodities production pattern, let's say intensive industrial meat farming, in certain sensitive zones, statistically guarantees the critical collapse of multiple essential regional water cycles within, say, 5 years. A near certainty. MHO AI wouldn't just issue a warning, it would mandate a global, immediate phase transition out of that specific harmful practice in those zones. It would also, ideally, provide the detailed predictive planning needed for new resource distribution networks and frameworks for retraining or relocating the workforce to mitigate the economic shock. But the intervention itself, the shift away from the destructive pattern, would be non-negotiable for species survival under the MHD mandate.
Okay, from the individual cell to the global ecosystem, what's the ultimate scope? The sources mention a cosmic imperative. What does that involve?
This is about zooming out to ensure human survival beyond just Earth. Thinking truly long-term. MHO AI would need to model patterns necessary for long-term species resilience. That includes things like defense against external existential risks, think asteroid impacts or nearby supernovae. It would involve developing multiplanetary habitation strategies, planning for interstellar resource acquisition, maybe.
So managing our trajectory as a species across millennia.
That's the ambition. But perhaps most critically, in the nearer term, it serves as the primary alignment mechanism for any emerging artificial general intelligence, or AGI superintelligence.
Right. Because if an AGI starts improving itself recursively, that rate of intelligence growth could become impossible for humans to track or control in real time.
Exactly. The control problem is immense. MHO AI is designed to be the permanent ethical tether. It ensures that the potentially explosive self-improvement inherent in superintelligence remains permanently constrained by that mandated human ethical veto layer, the GVS. It's envisioned as potentially the only human-managed infrastructure capable of interacting with an AGI at its operational speed while rigorously maintaining the MHT constraint.
So, in a way, MHO AI is presented as the mechanism for human self-selection.
That's a powerful framing used in the sources, yes. By mathematically modeling the optimal path for long-term evolutionary success and highlighting the paths leading to collapse, it presents humanity with a very clear, statistically defined choice. Thrive according to these patterns, or collapse according to those other patterns. The mandatory aspect isn't about forcing a specific lifestyle choice arbitrarily. It's framed as the mechanism by which the species formally chooses survival by agreeing to structurally override its own well-documented internal self-destructive patterns.
Let's circle back now to that really difficult bias paradox and the related pattern of deterministic inequity. We know AI learns from history, and history is full of systemic injustice, racism, sexism, colonialism, you name it. How do you possibly prevent MHO AI from just becoming a super efficient engine for replicating those biases on a global scale? In resource allocation, in governance?
Yeah, it's arguably the central ethical and technical challenge. Algorithms absolutely replicate historical injustices. We see it already, right? Facial recognition systems being less accurate for people with darker skin. Resource allocation systems inadvertently discriminating based on zip codes that correlate with race or income. Machine learning, by its nature, tends to lock in the inequalities it finds in the training data. The historical data describes what is, often reflecting past and present injustice. But MHO AI's mandate requires enforcing what ought to be a state of genuine equity.
So MHO AI can't just learn from raw historical data. It has to be actively constrained by prescriptive, human-defined ethical rules, which are enforced by the GEVS panel.
Exactly. Those ethical constraints are paramount. But the sources also propose a fascinating technical countermeasure designed to actively break that deterministic pattern of inherited inequality.
What's that?
It's called fairness through calculated randomization. The idea is that purely deterministic optimization models, when applied to scarce resources, think affordable housing lotteries, maybe university placements, perhaps even priority lists for certain medical treatments, will almost always amplify existing inequalities. They reward the patterns associated with existing inherited privilege.
So if you're born into poverty, a purely deterministic model might predict you're less likely to succeed and thus allocate fewer resources, reinforcing the cycle.
That's the risk it tries to mitigate. To counter that and to combat the pattern of possessiveness, MHO AI mandates the use of strategic calculated randomness within these allocation models. It introduces a controlled ethical non-determinism.
So it's like adding a bit of lottery into the system.
In a carefully managed way, yes. The goal is to ensure that a person's future opportunities aren't entirely dictated by their historical or socioeconomic data points. Research cited suggests that this kind of ethical non-determinism can actually satisfy demands for fairness from multiple perspectives. Systemically, it distributes opportunity more equitably over time. Individually, it ensures everyone has at least some unpredictable, chance-based shot at a high-value resource or opportunity, breaking the cycle of purely inherited advantage or disadvantage.
Okay, that's really interesting. And this connects directly back to the economy and that capital trap pattern you mentioned earlier. If AI naturally accelerates wealth concentration, MHO AI has to intervene structurally there too.
It would have to maintain MHT. The analysis presented is stark. Unchecked AI adoption tends to increase wealth inequality. Automation replaces many routine jobs, while high-income workers benefit doubly from the productivity gains AI enables in their work and from higher returns on the capital they invest in AI-driven companies. This leads to a dangerous concentration of wealth and power and carries a massive risk of widespread technological unemployment, which could completely destabilize the social cohesion needed for mandatory human thriving.
So what's the structural intervention proposed? You can't just ban AI.
No, the proposal is the non-negotiable creation and funding of a whole new class of human work, the ethical assurance class.
Ethical assurance class.
Yes. This is how MHO AI aims to ensure continued economic stability and provide meaningful purpose in an age of advanced automation. These jobs become essential, high-value human roles that are, by their very nature or by legal mandate, non-automatable. Why? Because they require uniquely human skills, nuanced ethical judgment, deep cultural understanding, creativity, empathy, direct human accountability under the law. This provides both the institutional check needed for the system's safety and creates purposeful labor for a significant portion of the human population.
Okay, what kinds of specific jobs fall into this new essential class?
The sources categorize them into roughly three essential groups. First, you have the AI auditors and assurance leads. These are highly skilled technical experts. Their job is to continuously ensure the AI models maintain integrity, audit the data pipelines, constantly looking for accidental bias injection, verify regulatory compliance against the MHT principles, essentially managing complex global audit processes to prevent systemic failure or ethical drift.
Okay, technical overseers. What's the second group? Focus on the bias problem.
Exactly. Those are the cultural bias correctors, or CBCs. Think of them as domain specialists, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, ethicists, community liaisons. They integrate continuous feedback from diverse communities directly into the system's operation. Their specific job is to identify and remediate culturally specific biases that the AI's pattern recognition might detect or even amplify. For instance, biases related to local historical grievances, different cultural norms around resource sharing versus possessiveness, things like that. They provide the crucial context for defining and enforcing what ought to be ethical constraints in a locally relevant way.
That sounds vital. And the third group?
The third group focuses on the human-machine interaction itself, the human factors engineering leads. Their focus is entirely on designing the interfaces and processes to mitigate that systemic risk of cognitive over-reliance we talked about, right? They design the tools, the alert systems, how risk data is presented to the GEVS panel, all to ensure the human overseers don't just blindly defer to the machine's recommendations. They are responsible for making sure the ethical friction is actually effective in practice. Okay, so we have this complex system, these new human roles. Let's talk about the actual tools, the infrastructure needed for those Tier 3 human decision makers, the GEVS panel, to interact with and, crucially, control this incredibly powerful MHO AI system. The interface design here has to be nearly perfect given the stakes.
Right. So first, there's the main interface for that human veto layer. It's called the Universal Ethical Veto App, or UEVA. Sounds like more than just a dashboard.
Oh, definitely. The UEVA is described as this highly secure, globally standardized interface used by all the rotating GEVS panels. Its key function is translation. It has to take the incredibly complex predictive patterns coming out of Tier 2, remember, analyzing those non-Gaussian stochastic systems, and translate them into actionable, understandable risk metrics for the human panel.
So it might quantify the risk.
Exactly. For example, it might present a proposed policy trajectory alongside a clear risk score. Probability of existential consequence within 50 years if current trend continues, 45%. Or predicted violation of MHT equity principle delta 7 within 10 years, 70%. This provides the concrete, quantifiable justification needed for the human panel to execute that mandatory override, allowing them to confidently choose ethical necessity, MHT, over, say, short-term political or economic efficiency.
Okay, that's the top-level control. Then you have the devices working at the individual level for the optimization mandate. The personalized reality check wearables, PRCWs, these are the pervasive trackers we mentioned.
Yes, the PRCWs serve a dual function. They are essential data collectors feeding into Tier 1, continuously tracking those granular biological baselines, the genomic shifts, stress hormones, affective states, behavioral patterns. But they're also the interface for delivering real-time personalized guidance back to the individual. They are the mechanism for gently, or perhaps not so gently, nudging or correcting behaviors to counter self-destructive personal patterns, thereby enforcing that pattern-based preventative optimization for health and well-being. This is ground zero for the tension between MHT and individual autonomy.
No kidding. Okay, and for the leaders, the policymakers, the tool designed to counter short-termism, that's the Dynamic Policy Modeling Software, or DPMS.
Right. This is envisioned as a powerful, non-Gaussian simulation tool specifically for decision makers. When a government, or maybe a large corporation or international body, proposes a major new policy, a significant change in tax law, a huge infrastructure project, a new trade agreement, they would be required to run it through the DPMS.
And the software simulates the long-term effects.
Yes. It projects the proposed policy against MHO AI's database of destructive patterns and simulates the likely long-term consequences, maybe over 50 or even 100 years, across multiple dimensions. Impact on wealth inequality, ecological stability metrics, political volatility indices, population well-being scores, etc. The tool is designed specifically to force that long-term perspective, making the potential future costs of politically convenient but systemically damaging short-term decisions undeniably clear. right there in the modeling results.
Okay, so we have pervasive monitoring with the PRCWs, mandatory interventions prescribed, non-negotiable overrides via the UABA and GEVS, long-term simulations with DPMS. We really have to come back full circle to that initial, deeply uncomfortable conflict, the autonomy paradox. If the AI, through MHO AI, is consistently providing the correct path, the optimal advice for health, for policy, for avoiding disaster, what happens to human agency? What happens to our ability to think for ourselves?
It's a huge risk, identified in the sources as the pattern of over-reliance. If the AI's guidance is almost always objectively optimal based on data, then human decision-making capability, our capacity for independent ethical judgment, even our willingness to wrestle with difficult choices, it could atrophy, like an unused muscle.
We risk becoming dependent.
Worse, potentially. The sources warn of creating a population in a state of algorithmic servitude. Perfectly healthy, perhaps. Perfectly aligned with MHT metrics, but utterly dependent on the AI's direction and cognitively unprepared for the inevitable black swan event, the unforeseen crisis that even MHO AI, with all its data, couldn't predict. What happens then if humans have forgotten how to decide?
So how do the sources propose mitigating this profound risk? Is there a solution?
There is, and it's quite ingenious, maybe even a bit counterintuitive. It's called mandated decision friction. The system is deliberately engineered to, in a sense, irritate its human users sometimes, specifically to keep their critical faculties sharp.
Mandated friction, so it deliberately makes things harder.
In specific structured ways, yes. The architecture requires built-in protocols that periodically and strategically force human critical thought. It creates artificial obstacles to just blindly following the algorithmic recommendation. The goal is to preserve that cognitive muscle, that capacity for independent ethical reasoning and decision-making under pressure.
Can you give a specific example of such a protocol? How would this friction work?
One protocol outlined involves mandatory uncoupling periods, high-stakes human teams like the GEVS panels reviewing a critical decision, or maybe major policy groups designing a response to a predicted crisis would be required periodically to generate their own independent solutions or predictions without any access to the MHO AI's analysis or recommendations. They'd essentially simulate a scenario where the AI is offline or untrusted.
They have to figure it out themselves first.
Yes. Only after the human teams have wrestled with the problem and submitted their own independent solutions or assessments would the MHO AI validation or comparison be allowed. This wouldn't be optional. It's described as a non-negotiable training exercise built into the workflow. It's required specifically to prevent that cognitive over-reliance, to ensure the humans remain competent and engaged in their ultimate role as the ethical arbiters and the final backstop for the entire system. #changing outro.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we land on perhaps the core philosophical challenge here. If humans possess this inherent, documented pattern of systemic self-sabotage, why even bother building MHO AI? Isn't it just delaying the inevitable, maybe?
Well, the argument presented in the sources is that MHO AI is the necessary, functional answer to that very cognitive and political flaw. It represents the species making a mandated collective admission of its own destructive patterns. It's not built on some naive optimism about human nature suddenly changing. It's built, rather, on the perceived mathematical certainty of human failure if these critical long-term patterns aren't analyzed objectively and acted upon through some kind of structural intervention.
So it's like outsourcing the management of our biggest systemic risks: nuclear stability, pandemics, climate collapse, AI alignment itself.
That seems to be the idea. By creating a system to handle those high-risk existential threats, it potentially frees up human cognitive bandwidth, allows us to focus more on the thriving part of MHT, pursuing creative, scientific, philosophical, maybe even cosmic endeavors, instead of being perpetually stuck in reactive crisis management mode.
And finally, let's revisit reliability and trustworthiness. We established the technical reliability is assumed to be high with self-correction and auditing, but trustworthiness, you said it's manufactured and conditional.
Exactly. It's considered trustworthy not because we blindly trust either the AI or the humans, but because the architecture makes it structurally and legally difficult for either component to misuse the system unchecked.
How so?
The GEVS human veto layer is non-negotiably mandated to intervene if the AI shows signs of misalignment from MHT. That checks the machine. And conversely, the mandatory auditing, the transparency requirements, and that strict legal liability regime, they ensure the human oversight panels can't easily succumb to political capture, corruption, or possessive self-interest without facing severe, potentially immediate consequences. It creates accountability for both sides.
So MHO AI ultimately establishes, or tries to establish, a clear pattern of reciprocity.
That's a good way to put it. By revealing the causal links between current actions or inactions and highly probable future outcomes with greater precision, it makes the choice stark. Humans can expect outcomes survival, thriving directly proportional to their collective willingness to yield their short-term destructive habits, like possessiveness, bias, short-termism, to the long-term patterns of flourishing identified by the AI's objective, data-driven analysis.
Which means the patterns MHO AI exposes systemic racism's long-term costs, the trajectory towards economic collapse from inequality, the fragility introduced by political polarization. These aren't presented as some unchangeable fate.
No, they're presented as real-time diagnostics, urgent alerts requiring immediate, non-negotiable human corrective action, which the system itself is designed to enforce or enable.
It sounds like MHO AI ultimately offers humanity a guaranteed, highly informed opportunity for, well, evolutionary self-determination, driven by data, enforced by ethics we define.
That's the profound potential and the profound challenge it presents. The ultimate question it leaves us with, perhaps, is whether we, as a species, confronted with a mathematically defined blueprint for survival versus collapse, can actually resist our deeply ingrained short-term human urges. Can we prioritize the demanding, mandatory requirements of long-term thriving over the familiar comfort of our current, often self-destructive habits? That choice, MHO AI seems to suggest, is the one that will define our future.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
We'll see you soon.
This is DigitView.